Okay, so welcome to our session today. Our session is on exams and assignments for online courses. Can you believe it is August 4th already? And we're starting on the half hour, which has thrown all of my whole body chemistry off. So hopefully we're all ready to start at 10:30. We go for 90 minutes today. My name is Stephanie Rodick, and I'm the Manager of Professional Learning in the Office of Distance Education and E-Learning. And I'll have the rest of our folks introduce themselves. If you want to go next, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Holt, and I'm an instructional designer at ODE.
Hi, I'm Queenie Chow. I work at Office of Distance Ed along with Stephanie and Sarah.
And my name is Teresa Johnson. I'm an assistant director at the Michael V. Drake Institute for Teaching and Learning.
Great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what our outcomes and purposes are here today. So we have 5 outcomes for today. We hope that by the end of our 90 minutes, you'll be able to identify those considerations, opportunities, and limitations for moving those exams and assignments online. We will have you start thinking about how to modify those assignments and exams so that they best align, not just for the online context, but for your course context. So who are your students? Who are you? What are your interests and capabilities and realities here at this moment? We hope that you can decide on some of those modifications as guided by our learning outcomes. So we'll spend a little bit of time on learning outcomes this morning. And then we hope that you can start thinking about how you can incorporate those effective and hopefully more efficient grading strategies when you are teaching online. And then lastly, we'll hope that you'll get a better sense of what those resources are. So our agenda today, we'll first start talking about some of the considerations for autumn 2020, just to make sure that we're all on the same page here about what autumn 2020 is going to look like, in particular around assignments and exams. And then we're going to go through 5 best practices, and that will end up being kind of the agenda for today. We'll go through each of those 5 in order. And then lastly, we will just talk about a few resources. If you've joined us before, which I see lots of familiar faces in other workshops, the resources should look fairly familiar to you. We will be using some chats. We'll be doing a poll, and I wanted to give Queenie an opportunity to talk a little bit at this moment about how we will go ahead and have you participate and answer some of those questions, and just generally how we'll use chat.
Hi there. If you don't see the chat window already, you can just take your mouse and go down to the bottom of your screen. If you're on a mobile device, give it a quick tap and you'll see some buttons below. You can click on the speech bubble that says chat. I'll go ahead and post a link in there right now for you, so that you should probably see something blinking if you don't already have the chat up. So you don't have to participate in the chat if you don't want to, but that is a good place for you to ask questions throughout the session, and we'll help provide as many answers as possible. And I'll be sharing the slides for the session a few times throughout, just because it's for the benefit of people who arrive a little bit late. So if you see a little bit of repetitiveness, don't worry, it's just for the sake of people who joined a little bit later. We do have an email address that you can email after this if you have any questions after the session. So anything you need, feel free to pop it in the chat and we'll try to help you out.
So we do have 100+ folks today, and there are 3 facilitators and 1 chat monitor, and I have found that even that would be really challenging to get all of your questions all within our time frame. So you may see that we'll ask you to hold off on some questions or getting the answer until, because we know we're going to come to that section. We will stay in the end for a few minutes. We've typically been about 5 to 15 minutes staying afterwards to answer any questions that we didn't get to, or ones that are just more specific. And then you'll also see that Queenie will be suggesting things like individual consultations to get some of your very, very specific personal concerns and issues taken care of that we may not be able to do today, particularly when there are 112 of you who are here joining the 4 of us. So why don't we get started with just finding out how everyone is doing today. I think this is a good thing for us to do with our students, is to be able to check in to see how they're feeling. So today, we are hoping that you can use the chat to tell us how are you feeling and maybe a word or two about exams and assignments specifically. Thank you, Denise, for that very quick and honest answer of terrified. So normally we get like a very nice like range, right, Sarah? We get a lot of like, I'm feeling great. I think we got like one excited and one okay. Everyone else is thank you for those who are ready to learn and open to learning new things. There's a lot of overwhelmed, a lot of anxious, a lot of concerned, and that is completely understandable. So hopefully today we'll at least give you some starting places. And I will mention again now and several times that today is giving you the big picture of those best practices. We are not doing tutorials of specifically how to set up certain kinds of assignments or how to set up particular things with the gradebook. That is not what today's session is about. That's not what the outcomes are. We encourage you, because some of those are so specific, we'll go ahead and Queenie will be posting in, and several of us will too, be posting in some of the links to those tutorials that already exist, the Resource Center files that will give you step-by-step things, as well as links to workshops that we have done that stuff too. Just want to make sure everyone understands that like some of that anxiety I know is about like the how-tos. So we want to make sure we give you those resources. That there'll be a little bit of how-tos today, but it's not a tutorial day. Okay? So let's find out a little bit more of who you are. So now that I know that you're all freaking out, not really, but some of you are, let's do a little poll. So it's helpful for us to get a sense of what modality you're going to be teaching in, and just select all that apply, because some are going to be in person fully, some are going to be hybrid. So I have a poll here for you where you can select as many as you need to. So are you going to be teaching in person? And of course, we'll talk here in a moment about how that's only until like the Thanksgiving break, and then after that, we'll all be online. Hybrid, fully online. Or so far we've got about up to 15 of you, 16 of you who are supporting the teaching of others. So you're in a role similar to the four of us as facilitators. So I have about 80% who have voted, and I just want to give you another couple seconds here to get as many of you as possible. All right, so I've got 91 of you, 92. That's pretty good. All right, so let's share who you are. So not surprisingly, 68% of you are teaching fully online. That makes a lot of sense since today's session is on creating exams and assignments for the online environment. But I'm glad to see that we have a whole bunch of hybrid folks. So welcome. And I think you'll get quite a bit of this out of this session on how to manage both of those environments and how to take those exams and assignments and put them online in some kind of consistent way for your students. And then for our in-person folks, you'll probably hear us say a few times in different ways that it would be best to put your stuff online so that in case something does happen and we're not in person anymore, COVID's going to do what COVID does. We want you to be prepared. And welcome to the 22 of you who are supporting others. Okay, so Teresa, do you want to start us off with considerations for autumn?
Absolutely. All right, so just to sort of set the stage for us to remind ourselves where we are and what season it is. Thinking about moving into fall, as you could see in the poll, we are going to be teaching in a variety of delivery modes in the fall, all the way from fully in-person courses, which of course will only be until Thanksgiving break, but there are some courses that are being taught that way, to fully online courses the entire semester. And then there's a wide variety of different percentages of hybrid in-person versus online. And those go by some different titles. The second thing that we want to think about is making sure that we are still following the Carmen Key 4. Those are the 4 areas that you need to make sure that you have on Carmen. You can learn more about that at the Keep Teaching site. And basically those are making sure you have your syllabus online, that you have your course materials online, and in particular for this section, we're going to be talking about assignments. We want to make sure that you're using your gradebook through Carmen. And this is not something that you have to create separately. It is created for you by the fact that you are publishing your graded assignments. So it gets created as an output of the fact that you've put your assignments in there, or your discussions or quizzes or anything that's graded. And we are also asking people to make sure that you are doing online submissions through Canvas, through Carmen, whenever possible, and especially for that last week of the semester and for final exams, in which all of our courses will be online, and so those things will need to be online submissions. So it's important to make sure that you know how to do that and have thought through that for your assignments. We all also just wanted to make a note that we all remind ourselves that we are not the only ones going through this, that our students and other instructors, we're all going through this global health crisis together, and that causes certain issues for our students, such as technology issues. They may not be able to get online or have great bandwidth, that they may be going through illness with themselves or their family, and that they may be experiencing family and housing situations and other issues that may cause stressors that we are not used to dealing with before we even get to the point of trying to learn through courses. So we just wanted to sort of set that picture for ourselves. That sets us up for thinking about, with all of this going on and teaching in different modalities than we may be used to, how do we know if students are meeting our learning outcomes? And I'm sure that's why you're all here, is because you want to help figuring that out. So that's what we're going to try to do today. This is going to be organized through going through this set of best practices. The first thing that we're going to do is talk about how to make sure that we are making sure our assessments are aligned with our learning outcomes. So if there's good alignment there, then we're going to be able to do a better job at that. So we'll talk about what that means. We'll also talk about why authentic assignments are a particularly good idea to design as part of online and hybrid courses. And we will talk about how to use Carmen tools such as the assignments, the Carmen quizzes tool, and Carmen discussion to be able to create those assessments and put them in Carmen so that they can turn things in online. We will also discuss what transparency means in assignment design and why that is valuable for you and your students. We will all then spend a little bit of time thinking about, as you are designing those assignments, how to redistribute the workload and the point values from maybe what might have been a more typical process for you in the past, to thinking about how to redistribute those a bit so that they fit better into this new level of stress and modalities that we are using. And having done all of that, we also hope that, and we will discuss a little bit about how to create some efficiencies in grading so that your stress level is also lower, because we also don't want all of this redesign to create a higher level of stress for you. We actually want to make it easier on you. So that's what we'll be doing today.
We'll try.
We will try. Do our best.
All stressful. We all recognize that. We're all stressed out. Okay, thank you, Teresa. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with this idea of learning outcomes. And I know many of you probably already think very carefully about your learning outcomes. Maybe you have done a course design institute in the past with the Drake Institute, where you've thought about always starting with, where do I want my students to be by the very end? What do I want them to look like, experience, right? how do I want them to be different, which are our goals. And then we take those goals and we break them down into our learning outcomes. So what are the actual things I want my students to be able to do, right, and to demonstrate to me about their learning, long before we start thinking about what those assignments and exams are. And we know that most of us here, out of the 119 of you that are joining us today, you're not all redesigning your courses completely from scratch. But we do still want to think about, how do I make sure that those assignments and those exams, if I have to modify them, that I'm not just throwing stuff in there to just put it online, that I'm thinking through carefully. And I know you all want to do that, but what's a strategy on how to do that? And one way is to just make sure that we're using those learning outcomes really carefully and strategically. So for those of you who need a refresher on what those learning outcomes kind of would look like and what they are, right? So these are very active kinds of things we want our students to be able to demonstrate to us about their learning. So Bloom's taxonomy typically puts them in a nice little triangle, and they kind of start with things at the most foundational level, which is remember. Can my students actually recognize and recall information? And then it builds up to understanding. Do my students understand something well enough that they can explain or make inferences? And then applying. So do I want my students to actually be able to implement something and to apply, right, this content knowledge to something new? Or maybe you want your students to analyze and you want them to be able to look at something, pull it apart, look at the different pieces and understand how those pieces are organized and put together. How are things different from one another, right? They're really getting deeper into their understanding, so much so that they can really pull things apart, right? And maybe put things back together in a different way. And then there's evaluating. So perhaps you're teaching a course where much of what you want your students to do is critique and judge and make judgments, right? Particularly if you're doing courses that are for our graduate students or our upper level courses, where you're also going to have your students remember and understand and apply, but you want to focus heavily on, can my students really use the disciplinary judgment and criteria, right, that we use in our field with new content. And then finally, create. So do you have a course where they're really actually generating new information, new patterns, right? Are they creating new plans? So we just want you to think about, as we move along and show you some examples, what are the kinds of things that I want my students to be able to do? So the way that we tend to talk about this alignment process is that our assessments, so our discussions, our projects, our exams, right, all of those kinds of things align with one or more of those course learning outcomes. So we don't want to just test our students' ability to apply once, right? It's probably a many-to-many relationship. I have several assessments that I'm going to use. I have some quizzes and I have a project that I want to use to assess my students' ability to be able to apply concept X, Y, and Z. So they have several opportunities to do that through several different types of assignments. And you'll see that one of the best practices is really to change up and have a variety of ways to do that, which is incredibly important when we're starting to think about doing this online. So one thing you'll see over and over again is that there are lots of examples here. Almost none of them are high stakes exams. They're things that are broken down into much smaller pieces. So we just want you to think through, for each of those assessments that you've created, do I need to modify them so that I'm having my students actually make sure that that they can advance, right, their achievement of those outcomes. So that's kind of the basic foundational level here that we wanted to start with. Here are some examples that I'm just going to kind of breeze through to give us a taste of what some of those assignments may look like already for you. And you are welcome to, I'll give you a space here at the end of this to share in the chat, some of the other kinds of things you're doing with your learning outcomes. You're welcome to start adding them now if you want, but we will have a space to do that. So the first level of remember, right? Maybe you're having students list out some of the theories, or list some terminologies, or list some events, right? And what I wanted to do in these slides is to also give you a sense of where those things would live in the Carmen tool set. So you'll see things like a Carmen assignment, a Carmen quiz, or a discussion board. When Sarah comes on board here soon, she's going to go through each of those and actually share more robust examples than these, but also more about those tools and how to use them. But I wanted to give you a sense just visually as we move along to see that there are lots of different ways, and these are not the only ways, but I wanted to give you a sense of what are some possible ways that you could do this using Carmen. Okay, so do you want students to list things? Do you want them to label things? Do you want them to show that they understand, right? So perhaps you have them at some point classify particular kinds of events, not just identify them, but show they understand it by classifying them around particular criteria. Maybe you want them to compare theories or compare systems. Maybe you just want them to understand, show that they understand by summarizing it. Can they summarize it accurately? Right? That will certainly show that they can, that they do understand it. And you can see the variety here of the different kinds of tools you can use in Carmen to do that. Maybe if you are doing application, you're having students describe some steps in the simulation. Maybe you're actually having them do a simulation, but we also know online and in just the current climate that we're in, maybe we need to break that down a little more. And maybe the first step is just to describe the steps that would happen in a simulation before actually doing the simulation. Or maybe they're selecting an equation for a problem rather than just actually doing and solving for the equation. Can they actually choose the right one to use? And maybe that's a way to break down that kind of outcome rather than just use it to create a solution, but do they even understand which kind of assignment or equation to use in an assignment? Analyze examples may be something like cause and effect relationships. Can you give them a case study, a small case study? The example that I have here is maybe doing it as an assignment, or you can do it as a quiz, an exam question. One thing I should say right up front, and Sarah will repeat this, I'm sure, is that if you haven't used the Carmen quiz function, it's called quiz, but you can use it for lots of different things, including an exam. So I want to make sure I say that up front. Maybe you want to have your students that's a lot of S's, have your student show maybe intent with a particular example of something, or maybe show how bias and intent, right, could change the outcome, right? Maybe that's an assignment. If you're having them evaluate things, maybe this is where that critiquing piece goes. Maybe they're critiquing a performance or critiquing a reading that they had to do, right? And they're using very specific disciplinary criteria that you've gone through with them, so they understand, well, what is it that I'm actually comparing to, right? What am I using as my criteria? And then finally, creating. Sarah will go through some ideas of performance-based things. Here are some examples of just create and upload a performance. Sarah will talk about how to do that. Maybe you have students create a plan, or at least write up parts of the plan and maybe list recommendations, right, for why they have that plan with a rationale for that as an assignment. So hopefully you can see just very quickly in those examples that there's some alignment there, right? I'm always thinking about that assignment and what is it that I want my students to be able to demonstrate to me in that assignment. So if you haven't already, if you could in the chat, if you want, you don't have to, but we're kind of curious about what Bloom's levels you're typically emphasizing in your learning outcomes. And obviously we're having you think about one particular course. Like Lexine wrote alls, yes, it could be all of them. But some of you, it's a particular population of students, a particular level of course, and maybe you are as Sinead had written, right? Sinead's teaching our future nurses. Yeah, I would love, right, for them to eventually be getting to this analyzing and being good clinical reasoners. Oh, good. So we've got a huge variety here, which is great. So hopefully we'll be able to show you a couple of other examples that will spark and inspire your creativity to think through how else could I kind of modify an assignment that I typically would have done in my classroom and put it online in order to test for and assess for, right, application, creativity, etc. All right, Teresa. So she's going to talk about authentic assessments for a little bit. Go ahead.
All right, so authentic assessments are assessments that mimic something that people would do in the field that you are teaching. So a task that would really happen in that kind of role or in that kind of field. So they're relevant, they're purposeful. It's very different than just taking a multiple choice exam, which is not something that most of us spend a lot of time doing in our fields of study once we're out of school. They also tend to help us create situations where students can negotiate really complex tasks where it asks them to do multiple of these outcomes at the same time. And we find in the research shows us that authentic assessments are a really great way to increase student motivation, that students really like it when we find something where perhaps the audience isn't just you as the teacher, that the audience is either their peers or the outside world in some way, or a business consultant or somebody outside of just writing it for you as the instructor. It makes a big difference. So thinking about who's my audience for this assignment can help. Thinking about what is real world content right now. There is so much going on, so many different effects of this virus, for example. There's just a wealth of ways. I was reading an article last night about ways that we can use what is going on with this virus to create real world content for almost any field of study. And to use formats. So use whether it's a blog post or a letter or some things like that that are more realistic ways to write or to interact with people than our typical exams might be. Okay, Stephanie, thank you. So here's some other examples, and you can see that these are written with particular fields of study in mind, but that you can probably easily find ways to take some of these and transfer them into other fields of study. But this just gives you an idea of what do authentic assignments look like. You'll also notice that some of the things that Stephanie was going through in the slides earlier with the particular verbs for outcomes also had several types of authentic assignments in them. So things like having students write a business plan or create a statistical model for something. If it is anything to do with education, creating a lesson plan for something in particular, rather than just writing about how would I teach students. So that gives you the idea of what we mean by authenticity. And they are particularly useful for thinking about online and hybrid courses, because it really gets us away from these things where it's an issue of how do I write a multiple choice exam that they're not going to be able to just look up the answers. These are the sorts of things that are harder for students to just download answers to, that you can't just Google these things. These things are very specific and allow them to use these skills in a complex way. So here are a couple of very specific examples. These are things that have been used here on campus in different courses. This is one from pharmacy, and this one is having students look at real world content in different articles that are in the popular press. And then each time they do this, they have to choose a different viewpoint when they write answers to a particular set of questions. And each time they have to choose a different viewpoint. So it really forces them to think about what are the different lenses that they might be using in thinking about this field of study and responding to things that are actually going on in the news at any one point in time. Okay, next. This one is about biostatistics, and this one asks their students to, in response to a particular type of research proposal that they're writing, to talk about and plan for how it is important to use a biostatistician in these research proposals. And so it asks them to think about what is the importance of that and what role would that person serve. So it really asks them to summarize and to synthesize a lot of the things that has been talked about in that particular course. And this one is, if you have not seen Eric Mazur do his video about assessment, the silent killer of learning, I would highly recommend that you look that up. If you just type in MAZUR and silent killer of learning, it'll pop right up. It's a lovely video that he's done on this. The basic idea, though, is that we typically ask students questions in ways that we lead them right to the process that we want them to use, rather than allowing them to sort of muck around and figure out, what is it that I need to assume? What are my assumptions? What equation might I be able to use that we have talked about that might fill this need? Rather than, you can see on the right, it gives them all of the assumptions. It tells them, this is what you need to know. Basically, this is how you solve it. But if you just ask them a real world problem and let them discover how it is that you solve this, that can be a lot more powerful. Now, you have to provide some scaffolding for these types of things, so you don't just drop them in the deep end with this, but it gives you the idea of what does an authentic exam question look like versus one that feeds them all of this directly.
And Queenie went ahead and kindly found that video for you. So
Oh, thank you, Queenie. You're just on top of it. Thank you for doing that. So I'm interested in hearing whether you ask your students to do authentic tasks already. Now that we've talked about it, maybe you find that you didn't know you were doing authentic assignments, and it turns out that you are. And if you have any interesting ones that you want to put in the chat, we'd love to see whether you're doing that, and if there are other things that you would recommend for the rest of us to think about. A scaffolding video. I don't know. Stephanie, do you know of anything that would talk more about scaffolding? Do we have any of those that we've made?
No, but I'm going to look for some while Sarah's doing her part.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be interesting to find. But the basic idea of scaffolding is to make sure that you aren't asking students to make big leaps in the skills that you're doing, that you are giving them small steps, and that you give them feedback along the way. So breaking down a big assignment into small chunks and giving them feedback at every step, so that they know that they are doing that piece correctly. And okay, let's talk about the next piece, because often it's the big jump that is hard for them to figure out. What are all of the small pieces? It makes sense to you because you've done it a lot, but that's what's hard. Okay, so we're getting some interesting things in here. Something called Startup Wars. Participant science. That's, yes, I love the like the cures, where students are actually participating in real research projects that go on across the country. Yeah, there's some really great stuff out there. Okay. Looks like there's a lot of great stuff. I can't wait to go back and read all of the chat. It's going by too fast for me to even read it, which is great. It means that there's a lot there that you're doing.
Which reminds me that before I have Sarah start talking about some tools here, I can't remember if we said this already. I think I just do too many workshops, but down below on the bottom right of your chat, if we said it and you didn't, you need to hear it again. There's those three buttons. If you click on those three little dots, right? Not three buttons, three dots, click on the button with the three dots, and then you can save the chat. So we'll be saving the chat as well, but you should be saving the chat if you want to make sure that you have it and it's just saved on your device. Okay, Sarah, you ready? Or do you want to just have?
I'll just share.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so Stephanie already talked a little bit about some of the ways we can start choosing tools in Carmen, but we wanted to dig a little bit more into each tool and show you what that might look like and some of the effective ways that people have used these very basic Carmen embedded tools in creative ways to kind of encompass the majority of the types of exams or finals or major assignments that you might be considering. So a lot of you are thinking about exams right now, knowing that all of those finals weeks are going to be online no matter what your modality is. So let's kind of start with thinking about those. The Carmen quiz tool, as Stephanie said, it's called quizzes, but you can actually use it for any kind of interaction where a student is going to work individually, they're going to work on their own, and you're going to show them some kind of information and then ask them to answer a question. So obviously this lends itself really, really well to our midterms, to our exams, and to quizzes. You can also use it for activities or practice and those kinds of things. Some of the nice features of this tool are that you can do all different kinds of questions within the same quiz or exam. So you can do multiple choice, you can have fill in the blanks, and you can have short answer questions. And even though they're called short answers, those could be incredibly long essays if that's how you want to play it. You can also ask them to upload files into these quizzes. They can download your files. You can use pictures. You can link to other websites. You can have videos embedded right in there. And so this is a really powerful tool to do those kinds of things I was seeing in the chat, to use a case study, a scenario-based exercise where you give them a little bit of information about the case study and ask them to make a decision, or ask them to justify or explain what just happened or predict what might happen next. So you can use this quiz tool to go so much more beyond that recall level multiple choice questions, and instead start to get some of those higher order things that I saw you were planning, those apply, analyze, evaluate, and critique. We do recommend, this came up in the chat as well, that if you are planning to use this for an exam where you're going to be doing a lot of those recall and remember type of things, if you want to increase academic integrity, you're going to want to change your settings to make sure that these are timed, give students a window where they can answer all of the questions once they begin the quiz. And then we do recommend open book. It's almost impossible to completely, make sure that students aren't using other materials. But on the other hand, if you're asking them to do a lot of recall and remember, we don't want our nurses only requiring their brains to remember every single drug interaction they've ever heard of, or to remember every single formula for how much dosage to give medication, right? We want them to go back and look that up. So sometimes knowing where to look is part of the skill that we care about. And realistically, if you're using your time limits effectively, it's not going to be possible for students who are completely unfamiliar with the material to go through their notes or to Google quickly enough to answer those kinds of apply or evaluate questions, or to know where to even find all of the recall things if they're not familiar with that material in the first place. So it is a pretty powerful tool, but it's not the only way that you might want to handle an exam. Carmen also has an assignments tool that we recommend if you either want students to work in groups and turn in something that was collaboratively created, like a presentation or a group paper, or if they've worked together on a prospectus or some kind of a research proposal. If they're working in groups, you probably want to have them turn that in using the assignments tool. Or if they're working individually on something where you only want to see the final product. Again, the quizzes, you show them something, they answer a question. You show them something, they answer a question. The assignments tool is when they do a lot of work and you only want to see the final product. So with the assignments tool, if you're thinking about a final exam or a midterm kind of assessment, we recommend doing these as a kind of a take-home style exam. So you would give them several days and say, this is due on Sunday or Friday, whatever works best for you. Usually we recommend 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, and that you could give them a series of questions, and they would be able to use whatever materials they have that are relevant and write out long form answers to that. That might be a case study or a series of essay questions. Most of you are probably familiar with that kind of take-home essay exam. So this works really well to submit that using the assignments tool. They can write that on their own Word doc, depending on how you set this up, or you might provide a Word document that has those prompts directly in the file. So Wei Fang was mentioning earlier that using case studies and wanting to provide some kind of a form for students to submit. There are several different kinds of survey things where you could have them write that right into a true form, but what I would recommend is sort of pre-populating a worksheet with those prompts and asking them to write their own responses, save it with their last name in the title, and upload it to a Carmen assignment. If you've been in any of our other workshops lately, you'll have come across the term of a Carmen template. And so we are really recommending that people add a series of instructions to make their expectations really explicit in all of our Carmen items. And this goes for quizzes too. So we really would like you to think about adding instructions to your quizzes that make it very, very clear to students, why are you being quizzed or taking this exam? Like, what is the purpose of this? Is it to recall all of the things we learned all term? Is it cumulative? Is this just to check your understanding on this week's material? Is it to help you practice? I saw in the chat, someone needs her students to have that fluency of the recall of the plant names and identification. Is this to help you build speed and fluency in your recall so that you can do more interesting things with that information? If we give students a little bit of information about why we're using this quiz, it helps them understand how to show you what they've learned. Give them those guidelines for that academic integrity. Is it open book, or should they not be using any other materials? Are they able to go back and think about the discussions that they've had in your class, or the collaborations they've done in their groups, or is this meant to be work that they truly do on their own? We can put those directions right here in every quiz. Don't rely on having said it on the very first day of class or having it in the syllabus, and now it's finals week and they haven't thought about it for several weeks. We can put it right here in every single quiz. And then the directions. How many attempts will they have? How long do they have once they begin? What should they do to prepare before they start the quiz so that they're not wasting their attempt if they haven't really prepared themselves? You can put all of that information right here. And this is an example of giving them those supports that they need. If you're asking them to use another website or other course materials that are in Carmen, if you want them to use a worksheet, you can link that right here in the quiz so that once they've opened that quiz, they have everything they need to get started and show you what they've learned. This is an example of the student view if you mix some of those question types. And one of the things that we really like about the quiz tool is that you can do those mixed levels. Many of you said you were going to have lots of different Bloom's levels that you're assessing your students on. And so a quiz can let you do those within a single assignment. So in this case, they've got a question here that's a recall question, identifying some of the things from the readings, those primary stressors in question 7. But for question 8, they're going to do a little bit more of a complicated synthesis and evaluation level. Here they're drawing on an article they should have read before they take this quiz. And then they have a 2-part essay question here where they have to summarize the main findings and then evaluate. What does that mean? What is that data table? Why is that important? And you can see that you can change the weights of the questions here. So that recall question, it's important. The instructor wants to make sure that the students got those main points, but it's not really as important as those higher order things. So that question is worth significantly fewer points than that larger written question. Another thing, a lot of you were mentioning the overwhelming nature of grading. If you have a high enrollment course, you can still use questions like this, and Carmen will let you add automatic feedback even to your essay questions. So you might do something like ask a question, a 2-part essay question like this, and then leave some automated feedback that all students will see, where you might say a good answer would include these points, and kind of summarize those things you're looking for. That means when you go back in your grading, yes, you still have to read all those individual questions, but you don't have to leave individual feedback or correct each student one at a time. You can just skim their answer, add your points, and you're good to go. So even though it is more work to grade some of these short form written answers, there are still ways in this tool to make that more efficient. If you're thinking about using assignments where you only want to see that end product, if you're going to use assignments throughout the term, or you have some kind of a final project or research paper kind of thing, we would sort of nudge you towards that assignments tool in Carmen. And so if you're thinking about how students will submit this, it's a really flexible tool. Obviously, students can upload a Word document where they've done some writing for you, for example. But you can set those submission types that they can type directly into the box. So if you want them to just do something on their phone really quickly, it's not a huge assignment, you just want their response to something, they can do it on a phone or an iPad really quickly. You could have them record a video of themselves or audio, a response that they might be role playing or communicating with their voice in some way that you want to hear. You could have them submit PowerPoints. Any kind of file or submission is possible using this assignment type or assignment tool. The key thing here, and this is to reiterate something that Stephanie said earlier, is making sure that you set up your assignment types to be online submissions. And ideally, all of your assignments, no matter what modality you're teaching in, will be submitted online. We don't really want you to be collecting a lot of paper copies from your students and having to collect those and possibly quarantine that material. As much as possible, if you can have them submitting things in Carmen, then we're reducing all of our risk collectively. But it also helps you keep track of who's on track in the course so that you don't get to week 4 and realize that there are some students who haven't turned anything in. It means that if you need to take a break from teaching for health-related reasons or for COVID disruptions or technology issues, one of your coworkers, your peers, your colleagues can step in and keep things running because they have that submission process. It doesn't rely on you having all of the paper copies of the grades, right? We also want you to think creatively about your assignments. Not everything has to be turned in from one student to one instructor. Sometimes we can use those discussion spaces as graded discussions to see their work and also let students respond to each other. So a discussion thread can be set up to be graded. You can set it for individually, that the whole class, everybody posts one at a time, or you can put them into small groups and kind of have them build smaller communities where they're interacting. They can submit text responses, or they can make videos. You can upload any files that you might want them to share, and then they can respond to each other. The reason why we bring this up in this particular workshop is many of you are used to doing a final presentation or some kind of a research project where students might be normally showcasing a poster session in your department hallway, or some kind of the last several days of class are different students or groups of students sharing work they've done together. And a discussion is a great place where they can post that initial product, the artifact of their work, and you can grade that on its own. But they can also see each other's posters or presentations and give each other feedback and continue to learn in that way. This is an example of our Carmen template. And Queenie can share where you can access this template in the chat. But when we're all of these assignments, whether you're using the quiz tool, the assignment tool, or the discussions tool, we really encourage you to be incredibly explicit about your expectations. And this may be different for a lot of you who are used to having those informal opportunities in person to tell your students how to succeed. When you use the template, we would encourage you to include all of these different types of information. So what are the learning outcomes or objectives that this assignment aligns to? What should they include? And this is a bit literal. Are they creating a PowerPoint file? Are they including a Word doc? Are they including 3 paragraphs of text or a 7,000 word response? Whatever those specifics are can go right here. Again, we want to minimize them having to go all the way back to the syllabus and scroll down to page 24 just to know how to meet your expectations. And then 2 really important things that are pretty specific to online assignments are you can include the due dates when you set up these assignments. And students told us in spring that this was one of the most helpful things an instructor could do to keep them on track. When you add a due date to your Carmen assignment, it shows it to students in about 8 different places. It populates it everywhere that they are frequently going online for coursework. And so it really keeps them on track. It puts it in the places where they will see it. And our academic integrity statements. Again, I mentioned this with the quizzes, but if you can put this in every single place where a student is going to submit work to you, it really does cut down on academic misconduct. It helps students who are maybe in 5 different courses and maybe collaboration is required in one course, but not allowed in your course. Open book is required in another course because you want them to be finding and using good sources, but it's not allowed in another course where you want them to practice that quick recall. Just setting those expectations really helps them know how to meet your expectations, and more students will respond in kind. This is all based on research from the transparent assignment template, and we know that when you include all that different set of information in your expectations, not only are students more likely to meet your expectations, but we also are able to reduce the achievement gap in underrepresented minorities. So especially in this current moment where we are all working more mindfully to be more equitable in our education. And as the pandemic is increasing disparities in our student learning populations, this is a small thing you can do that will increase that equity in every assignment that you include in your course. So we would hopefully, hopefully that convinces you that it is worth that little bit of extra work to add all of those explanations in your Carmen space. This is an example of how students will see your assignments. This is a really pretty one. It uses one of our templates. You can have something similarly pretty if you follow that link that Queenie has shared. But you can see here that when we include all of this information on our end as we set it up, it's very clear to students immediately. When is it due? How many points is it worth? And what is the thing I'm going to be submitting? Do I submit this online? Do I need a file? This drastically reduces the amount of clarification emails or conversations you will need to have with your students. And again, we don't want you to become IT help. We want you to be using your experience as an instructor in more complicated ways. And so, putting those small things in when you set it up will really help the clarity for students and use your time more wisely. You can also see this one uses the entire template with all of those transparent template categories. So it may be more directions than you're used to seeing, but you can see that the instructions let students look ahead to the week and say, okay, I'm going to need to go here into another application. In this case, it's OneNote. So if you're asking them to use a Word doc, or you're asking them to use Twitter, or you're asking them to, watch a YouTube video, you can link that right here along with any directions to how to use that. If you want them to use Math Labs or any kind of external software that you might be using for your labs or their homework, if they're using Excel, you can put those help links, the FAQs, right here to keep them working and staying focused. This also shows that example of how that academic integrity might look in a specific example. There was a question earlier about, can I have them, working in a preset form? This is an example of a bioassay worksheet where they were given a data set and needed to do some things like record that, put it into their Excel plotting, use those equations within Excel to do the things. You maybe have data sets that are used differently for your students, but you can embed an Excel file or a worksheet that you've created as a Word doc right here into that assignment. You can ask them to complete it, type their own things into it, their answers, and then put it back up as a submission that then you can grade very quickly using SpeedGrader, all in Carmen. That lets you have pre-populated, grading responses, but also to keep all of their work in one place where they're easily reviewed. If you're going to use discussions as an assignment, again, even for discussions, we don't want to just be saying, please discuss the topics. You want to include all of those transparent assignment headers to really set clear expectations. This is very similar to the other kinds of assignments in terms of letting your students know, why are they doing this? What's the context? How should they prepare? What do they need to do to get ready? What are they actually doing and turning in for you? But this also should include some kind of guidelines for how to communicate with each other. What is a civil, respectful response in your discipline? Where do you want them to focus their comments so they're not just saying, oh yeah, your presentation was great. I loved when Stephanie added the title slide to her presentation and her presentation was very, very good. You can draw their attention to how they should give feedback. That might be a rubric, or it might be something more similar. Like we have here, this is a pretty basic set of instructions or guidelines for how students might respond in a more academic way. A lot of you use peer review of posters, of final projects, of drafts of longer writing pieces. There is a peer review tool in Carmen that you can use. It's a little bit complicated, so we are sort of encouraging people, if you're not going to use this frequently throughout the semester, if this is just sort of a one-time thing where you want them to see each other's work and give each other feedback, you can do that in a discussion board much more easily. And this is an example of some of the instructions you could use to how to post their initial product, what they should look at in each other's work, and how to give good feedback. So in this case, the instructor asked them to provide 3 or 4 actionable steps the writer could take to meet their goals for the piece. So they said, give them 3 or 4 pieces of feedback for next steps on how to make this writing better. So you can do those kinds of things using a discussion as your assignment, even though it's a discussion tool. Some courses have performance skills. So obviously this applies to our performance arts. If you have a dance class or an athletics class, that is probably very familiar to you. But other people may have labs where you are expecting students to demonstrate the kinds of manual skills. They're building things, they're using AutoCAD, they're going to demonstrate a pipetting technique, those kinds of things. And you can also use the Carmen assignments tool to let students show you those kinds of performances. Obviously, the easiest thing that they could do is record themselves doing the performance of whatever that skill or task is that you wanted to see. Most of our students have a device with a webcam, so they are able to take their phones or their iPads or their laptops and set it up and record themselves doing the thing, and then they can upload that video in the assignment tool as the assignment. You might also want to use Zoom if they need to give a speech for a communications class, for example, or if you would like them to show you something that they are doing with their voice. You can use Zoom and in real time have them do their performance. You can give feedback in that moment. You might have them book slots if you have juries or that kind of a structured setup where students will need 15, 20 minutes with just you as the instructor to demonstrate their language skills at the end of some of those higher level language courses, for example. You probably want them to book a spot ahead of time rather than having all of your students waiting and staring at each other as they do their finals. But if you're going to use anything where they need to have that synchronous interaction with you, you're going to want to have a plan B so that students who have tech access issues, who are ill or being quarantined or have other COVID-related disruptions, you need to have a plan B alternative for how they can show you that performance and still finish their assessment with you. Again, Carmen Discussions is the best tool if you want students to share work with each other, and they can also post video in those responses as to show their performance, but they can also respond to each other with video or audio. So if they wanted to, do a sort of a call and response type of performance, that can be an appropriate way to assess those skills. And then I'll show you Carmen Quiz Tool for simple lab activities. This is an example if you needed them to interact with some materials. You may not be able to send all of those material kits home to them or have them be physically in the lab. But if you have some high quality photos or videos or 3D models of the things you wanted them to interact with, you can flip those questions into an online lab using that quiz tool. This is an example from anthropology in one of their archaeology labs where they needed to do some identification or some of those lower order recall and remember skills on the Bloom's taxonomy, but you could also use questions where they have a data set or see a video of someone doing something wrong and identify and critique their lab technique in those ways as well. This is just a screenshot of the way it will look to you if you wanted to make some of these easy videos. This is Stephanie doing her awesome media creation and recording that video response or creating a video. Maybe you want to do a case study that they respond to. You can record and be that character in the case study, or they can record and give those responses to each other. So it's a pretty easy interface. There's lots of tutorials for the specific steps on how to do this. So we won't go into that part now. We just want to spark your imagination. All right, did I go fast enough? We have time for a few questions, I think. So what questions do you still have about choosing the right Carmen tool to assess the learning you care about? Queenie, are there some in the chat that we haven't gotten to yet?
Yeah, I have a list here. Give me 1 second so I can bring it back up. I'll just kind of read through some of these that I don't think we had a chance to get to. Is there a way to add a rubric by question or just for the whole quiz? For some of these more kind of really specific technical questions, I would really recommend emailing carmen@osu.edu. But I'll read through these anyway, so you can kind of choose which ones we want to answer here. With quizzes, what's a good amount of time to allow per question, balancing legitimate thinking and writing time with not making it too easy for them to Google for answers? Is there one of these that has to use speed grader? I seem to remember that if I input grades on the grade sheet, it would disappear without using the speed grader. What if they're asked to work in groups but submit the assignment individually?
Okay, maybe let's take a few of those at a time. I cannot tell you how long each question in your quiz will need, but this is a great time to work with your colleagues or your grad students or your undergrads that have finished a course with you and get a couple of different perspectives. So if someone has taught this class in person, you can more or less assume that amount of time, if that exam took you 90 minutes in person, and then add a little buffer for the amount of time it takes students to maybe read things in a different format, or some scrolling, or the delay as you're clicking through buttons. It isn't drastically different. They don't need hours and hours of extra time if you're giving similar kinds of questions to what you've done in person. That said, a simple recall question, if your learning objective or learning outcome is that they need to quickly recall these kinds of names of plants, for example, then you want to give them a smaller time. But you want to think about, in those larger questions where they're maybe writing several paragraphs of a complicated synthesis and evaluation, they're going to need more time to do that thinking work and just remember, what was that article? What was the data? What am I doing? What do I want to say? What are my main points? Now I want to fix my language. Maybe I'm a non-native speaker and I want to, go back and have another pass on my English even after I've done the thinking. So we want to include all of those opportunities question by question. But I would encourage you to go to your peers in your department to say, how long do you think you would need for this? Or go to those grad students who have taken those courses and are a little bit closer to that phase of their learning, or an undergrad that you trust that has been through your course in the past. Those are good people to double check your gut reaction on the timing questions. One of the other ones was, what if I want students to work in a group but submit something individually? You can do that with assignments. You can, I would encourage you to give them like a discussion board just for their group as a place to do that work, so that you could kind of check in and say, Teresa didn't, check in until the very last day. And she's turning in a totally different paper. That might be something I want to address with her. Or it looks like Stephanie and Teresa did all the work without Sarah in the discussion board. So it gives you a little bit of that accountability if you're worried about integrity. But then the assignments, you can choose to set that up individually. Again, I would just remind you that students are in 3, 4, 5, 6 courses at a time. And the expectations for what counts as plagiarism is different in every single one of those classes. So if you're asking them to do group work and turn something in individually, make those expectations as clear as you can. Use the icons, remind them as many times as you can. Yes, you should be working on this for 3 weeks with your group, but when it's time, I want you to turn in your own writing, and that writing should not be the same writing as Teresa and Stephanie. Because that may be completely different in their other 4 courses. So if you're going to do something like that, just make it clear, but you absolutely can make the settings do that for you in the assignments.
We had just generally a lot of questions on academic integrity. So I directed people to an article on the Keep Teaching site. There's actually an entire link on the Keep Teaching site for assessment, and toward the bottom, it has articles that address academic integrity.
I did see one thing about academic integrity, mentioning that in the spring, it was pass-fail, it was emergency remote teaching, and that people felt like they didn't love how that turned out, and that's fine. I would encourage you to think of this as something that we can plan for. We can improve that situation by making choices in how you design your assignments now. You have all the way until December to get this together. We have plenty of months to change those question types and to do different things. We don't have to leave it at that spring emergency disaster management survival mode. We can do better. And that some of these small practices, like setting those expectations, putting those things in there now, we don't have to settle for survival mode anymore. And we'll spend a lot more time on that moving forward too.
I had a question here. I wasn't sure if you knew the answer to this. Can other students download a classmate's presentation video from discussions and circulate it on the web?
I think that would depend on how you are submitting it. If you made it just as a file link, they would need to open it and have it available. So possibly, if they are doing a video of themselves, then that is not as possible. There's a lot of smaller things I would have to know to be able to answer that definitively. But if you're asking them to do an authentic assignment, that's not going to help anybody cheat, even if they would do it. So ideally, you've made some design decisions that make that a question that is of less focus.
I see one that kind of came a little bit recently. Does anyone happen to know if we can require synchronous online time for discussion if the course doesn't have a set time scheduled?
You can. It is not allowed, but consider that right now this week is when students were given all of the adjustments to their schedules, and they are working really hard with all of their advisors right now to make sure that the courses that do have synchronous scheduled times are not going to conflict with each other. And they're going to be dropping courses and moving things around and making arrangements with instructors. I'm going to leave your class 10 minutes early and I'll be 10 minutes late to your class. So one week I'm going to leave Teresa's class early, and then the next week I'll be late to Stephanie's class because I might be required to be in person somewhere on campus and then be in a Zoom meeting, but I can't work on campus. A lot of the spaces where students would be sitting and getting online on campus are going to be closed for distancing or limited. So a lot of our students are going to have to be doing these quick changes between being on campus, driving home to connect to the internet. So if you're adding something after the fact that they were not able to plan for, you're adding a lot of stress for both yourself and for them. And it is going to be really, really difficult to require that. So you need to have a really robust plan B for what to do when that conflicts with things that students have spent weeks already adjusting. If you really, really need that synchronous time, I would encourage you to pick it now, set it, and make it clear to students in your syllabus and in the, contact the registrar so that they can be working on that now as they're still adjusting and not leave it till the first or second week of courses to spring on them.
Okay,
So we've got a couple more that popped up, but I wanted to make sure there's time.
There isn't.
Okay, yeah.
So we have tons of questions that came up, and some of them we're getting to. So let's move on and see which things we can pull up in our remaining time together. But I want to make sure that we get to, because some of the things we're going to talk about here. So how about, Teresa, you want to start us off with thinking about how to redistribute workload and point values?
Sure. So one of the things that we are really asking people to consider carefully is how to redistribute the way that you are giving points to students for their work. We know that high stakes testing is there are actually lots of issues with it, even in a good situation where we are able to teach the way that we want and we don't have a global pandemic going on. Right now, it's adding more stress to all of that. And if you have not read the book called Cheating Lessons by James Lang, you should go and find it and read it. One of his main messages there, if you are concerned about cheating, is to think about how you design your course. That we can, by lowering the stakes and redistributing points, breaking up assignments into smaller pieces, scaffolding assignments, doing those sorts of things, that we can greatly lessen the need for students to cheat. So I would recommend that we think about going through several different ways to redistribute the workload right now. I think we can go on to the next piece. This is one of the things that you will learn if you read Cheating Lessons or if you have read it, that we can actually begin to not just think about exams and ways to test student learning as a way just to know if they have learned, but to actually give them an opportunity to keep learning. We know that the brain, you can put about an infinite number of things into your brain. The problem is getting it back out. So the more times that we give students chances to practice in a low stakes way to retrieve information that we expect them to learn, the more more that they will have learned. So that is a good science-based reason to break up your major midterms into smaller things, to break up these high stakes assignments into smaller types of assignments, hopefully even authentic assignments. So this is one of the things that you can do. This is an example of a practice exam. So you can set up exams that don't have a time limit, that they don't get, the grade doesn't end up in the grade book, but it gives students a chance to practice in a realistic setting of what it's going to look like to actually do the exam with you, so that they can begin practicing that retrieval. Can I pull it out? Can I use it? This is what it might look like. This is an example of if we were to redistribute points in a way that lowers the stakes for our students. For example, if you look at before and after, it takes the final exam from a 15% of the entire course down to just 10%. It lowers the, or it increases the percentage then by 5% that are reliant on quizzes. So the final exam goes from 15 to 10, but graded quizzes goes from 15 to 20, because quizzes inherently, because they are smaller chunks and repeated throughout the semester, can be used as a really great low stakes way to give students retrieval practice and to show you what they've learned. They also raise the discussions from 10% up to 25%. So you can see that this creates a very different layout of points than what we might be used to normally, or what people often use. This is another really helpful idea of a way to keep checking to see how students are doing, making sure that they are continuing to remember and apply pieces of information as you move through a semester. So the important thing about this, I know it's small, but the thing to see here is that this is using a quiz bank and a question bank for quizzes. And so this first quiz has questions that have been covered over just the first weeks. So let's say week 1. So there's 10 questions there. And then in the next quiz, then there are only 2 questions from the first week, and then there are 8 questions from week 2. So you start interleaving these. So you have a few questions left from week 1, but you're adding in questions from week 2. And then by the third quiz and week 3, you have maybe 1 question from week 1, 1 question from week 2, and 7 questions from week 3. And so you can see that you keep going back a little bit. And the nice thing is that if you have a bank of questions, those questions won't be repeated in week 2 and week 3. Those would be different questions that you covered from week 1. So those would be different each time. In this particular setup for this class, students were able to take the quizzes as many times as they wanted. The average attempts that this setup that the students ended up using were only 2 times per student, or 2 attempts per student. What that tells us is that they aren't just randomly clicking at answers and taking it over and over and over again until they happen to get one where they get all the right answers. They're actually engaging with the material, and they're getting really good practice with recall. So this setup was pretty successful for this instructor. All right, so this is what this looks like on your end as the instructor. So the slide that we just showed you is what that looks like for the student. For your end, where you're creating these question banks, this is what this looks like. Now, obviously, you can't just dump a whole bunch of questions in here that are from the whole semester. You're going to have to do the work of separating those out into the different weeks so that this system would work if you wanted to use something like that. So there are multiple small banks. If this seems overwhelming to you, think about who your support system might be. Are you teaching this same course? Are there multiple sections that you're teaching this with other instructors that you might be able to pool your questions? Or have people taught this in the past that you might be able to ask them for some questions that they've used so that you have a larger number of questions rather than you having to write them all? Do you have GTAs available that could help you write questions? you might even, I've heard of people asking students to write questions, and they can get a point or two for writing questions for you, and then you promise to pick at least one of those to put in the bank. And if there are more good ones, you can put more in there, because you don't know how many students are going to actually end up pulling out randomly out of that bank. So this is a really good way to set up a system like that without having to do all of the work yourself. All right, and I want to circle back around to this whole having students learn while they're demonstrating learning to you. So what are other ways that we can use to do that? Things like using open book exams, where you're using the quiz bank like we were just talking about, or a randomization option where questions come up in different order. We know often that if questions always occur in the order in which the chapters occur, it gives them a mistaken sense of understanding things, because it's happening in the same order that the book happened in or that they read it. Whereas if you randomize them, it forces them to really think about which thing should I apply here, rather than it's the second question, it must be from the second chapter, therefore I need to use a chi-square for this because that's what chapter 2 was about. Adding more open-ended questions will also help with that. And making sure that that things are timed, so they don't just spend an inordinate amount of time on one question. Asking them about their thinking process, asking them to be metacognitive about things, is a really helpful way to see what it is that they're learning and ask them to be cognizant of their own learning. So tell me about your thinking process for this. What was your structure for solving this problem? That's also a good way to keep them from cheating, because if all they know is the right answer, they're not going to be able to explain how it is that they came to that answer. Using exam wrappers. Exam wrappers are something where you ask them to process, tell you something perhaps about how they studied for this exam, or how they felt like they did, or how they could do better on a particular part of this exam in the future. So asking them to do some thinking and reflecting about the exam that they just took, or that you've just handed back to them. So you can use that in a couple of different ways. So those are good ways to help them learn and improve their test taking skills or their assignment skills, depending on how you've written that out. All right, so we're watching in chat. What questions do you have for us about this whole section of redistributing your points or reworking your assignments to lower the stakes for your students?
I'm seeing the major themes are that a lot of people are still worried about academic integrity and cheating. And there are questions also about, this might be a communication question. It seems like people are just a little bit curious about certain things that are not well received by students. So how do we make it so that we can do these things that seem to work out, but also let the students know kind of why we're doing it and help them understand what's going on?
I always remind people that anytime we are doing something that doesn't look like what students consider a traditional sit and listen to lecture and answer a multiple choice exam, that we need to be good marketers, that we have to sell it. We have to explain to students why it is that we are doing what we're doing. And I think that explaining to them that I have created authentic assignments, or I have made a bunch of smaller assignments because it's going to help with your stress load, stress level. It's going to help you demonstrate your learning over time. It is going to help you keep up with the work so that you're not getting too far behind. I think you have to find the reasons that you think will resonate with students about why it is that you're doing that. And don't just tell them once, because right now I know that I can't remember something 5 minutes after my daughter has told me something. I'm thinking, what is it that you asked me for? So remember that we need to remind them multiple times about these things, that we need to give them lots of opportunities to remember why it is that we've designed things the way that we have.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay. So I'm hoping we have answered. We're answering in the chat, and we're also trying to put in a little bit more here about some of this academic integrity stuff. We know that this is a huge frustration for instructors. We know this is like probably the thing that's been surfacing the most, and it's a very complicated. Why students cheat that's a whole 4-hour workshop on its own, and we can do what we can do as instructors. So hopefully, the best practices that we're talking about allow you to know that you're doing your very best with doing this. And again, I will point out that several times in the chat. I've also pointed this out, but at the end, I'll give you the link to working with someone individually, whether that is someone who is in the Drake Institute or someone in OD, just to talk through for your own specific situation. Have I set everything up to do the best that I can with, making sure that Chegg doesn't come up and have students being paid to answer all the solutions, right? There's just a lot. There's a lot of challenges globally with all of this. So I first just want to recognize and make sure that I am saying, and that I'm being heard, that like we know that this is challenging and frustrating. So we're giving you the best practices for a normal circumstance, but we also know, remember way in the beginning, we talked about the stress of everything that's going on for students and us, and stress just causes all kinds of interesting decision making in all of us. So we know that it's challenging. Some of the things I'm going to talk to you about right now are not just about academic integrity, but just ways to make your life a little bit easier and more efficient with your time. So how many of you have actually used the Carmen rubric tool? You can give me the thumbs up with your emotion, or you can do your hand raising, or the yes, no. It's found in the participant thing or down below. I'm just curious of these things. So Carmen rubric tool, how many of you have used it? So quite a number. Okay, that's good. Not all of you, however. So let me clear all of that. Let me just quickly go over a few things philosophically, why you'd want to use the Carmen rubric tool. So I know rubrics also get a bad rap. I have come to love rubrics in my time of my 21 plus years here at Ohio State doing this job. They are hard and they do take a lot of time. And the time you need to put in is the time beforehand. It's not the time in the middle of when you're trying to grade stuff on a time frame and your kids are asking you to help them with their homework, right? Like you got to build that stuff up front when they can bug you up front, right? So that you can build it in when you're creating the assignment. So for each assignment, as you're working it out, keep notes on like what are the kind of defining features of this assignment, of this answer, of this solution. What is it that I'm looking for? And the more we can do that up front and try and keep track of those things, the easier it will be then to translate that into a rubric later. So we're trying to find little pieces of time for ourselves when we're actually trying to grade an enormous amount of work. The rubric tool for Carmen is really simple, and it's pretty simple to create. And I'll actually show you an example of it here. This is a very simple one for a discussion. And you can, I liked this particular example because I wanted you to see that you can change the point values. You can add as many or as few criteria as you want, but I liked it because it shows that, how some have 2 points, some have only 1 point in here. And you'll see the second one on writing style is either 0 or 1, right? And we've got some that have 0 to 2. And you literally just click on these little lines and it will ask you if you wanted to, to add or collapse them. So it's a pretty simple tool to use for those of you who haven't done it before. And it does kind of ensure that you are evaluating their work, more consistently than if you were going through each one independently without a rubric. There's obviously also the speed grader tool that we talked about earlier. And what I like about the rubric is once you create a rubric in Carmen for a particular assignment or exam, and I think the question was, can you create a rubric for each question? I don't know, Sarah, if you can answer that question in chat. But I don't think you can. I think it's just a rubric for each particular assignment or exam. Sarah will tell me if I'm wrong in the chat. But when you do that and you use the speed grader, if that's how you're going to, the rubric actually shows up on the bottom, and then you can, right, it's just all right there in one space. So we're trying to do things that help things go by quickly. You also may want to automate your feedback and your grading. So I did discover in some other sessions that we've done that people don't know these things exist. So when you go in and you create an exam through the quiz tool, so what's on the left is just a blown up version of what's on when you click edit, right? You click on the edit for an exam or quiz, and then you add a question, and you will in that right menu, you'll see for the menu for the exam or the quiz, you will see that this is one of the boxes that comes up. And when I click on let students see their quiz responses, it expands. And I just wanted you to see kind of an example of how you would do this. So there were a couple questions there of like, do I want them to be able to see, there's also something in here later on or maybe earlier. It says only show one at a time. You can lock students out, right, of questions. I think it's hidden right here on the left. This one is really about, do I want them to actually see their feedback automatically, right? So I give multiple choice. This happened to be for a multiple choice, a little quiz that was set up. And I do want my students to see the correct answer. You can actually let, only after their last attempt, depending on how many attempts you allow them, or after the last attempt, again, because you may give them more than one attempt. And if you want them to actually see the correct answers, right? So do you want them to see their answers? Do you want them to see, the correct answers? And you can even let it say like, okay, I want them to see the correct answers, but only after, because I know students have to take it at different times. So only like the Thursday after the time frame. That's what this is for. And then you can actually close and hide all the correct answers after a certain date as well. On the right is the example of actually in the question part of the quiz tool. This is a question that's taken actually from Anthropology. And this is a multiple choice question. Here is the actual question that you type in. And then I just wanted you to see that this is what you're looking for. There's this thing called answers down below, and you click on this box, and this is your first answer, right? And you edit, you click this little edit button, and you can type in, right, what are all the possible answers to this, right, multiple choice question. There's a little box right here, and when you click on it, this little gray thing opens up, and it says to click comments for the student if they choose this answer. So if they chose this first answer, which is not correct, because this one that's green is going to be the correct one. If they choose it, then they can get immediate feedback, and it will come up exactly what it is that you say. Nice try, close, here's why psychological tendency is not the answer to this, right? This one is a nice tool to use so that students are just getting that feedback immediately. And you don't have to keep writing that every single time. Who wants to do that? Who has time to do that? You may want to do that, but not a lot of people have time. All right. So lastly, I just wanted to talk briefly about some more academic integrity pieces. So, we've got a lot of heightened anxiety, causes a lot of confusion, stress, etc. So making sure that you're giving those clear expectations continually up front, particularly around collaboration. We had a couple questions about like, should I have my students work with each other or not? That's completely up to you, but you need to let them know what's acceptable or not. So you've set that in writing up front very clearly in your syllabus, probably in your explanation and directions for that assignment. In the spring, we talked to some people about, do you need the whole citation right now? Because we're like in a massive crisis moment, probably for autumn. Yeah, if you want citations, you need to let them know, like, yeah, we're doing the full class here, right? And part of those outcomes are about doing citations in an appropriate way. So you just need to tell them all of that stuff so that they know what to expect. We talked about those scaffolding and authentic assignments, about how those things will help with academic integrity. I am not suggesting it will get rid of everything. You do still have the option to use Turnitin for final papers or whatever else, any other paper that you want, but that is still an option that you have. Some questions were here about ExamSoft and what can we do with ExamSoft. You can use ExamSoft, but the university does not have a contract for the ExamSoft proctoring program. So that's an additional piece. So you can use ExamSoft for all the things we talked about with assignments, but that proctoring program, that is not something that the university has a contract for. So it's an extra cost that you can try and maybe have your department pay for, but I'm having a feeling they probably are not going to. And then lastly, I just wanted to show you what a commitment to integrity looks like. There is quite a bit of research to suggest that this can curb some misconduct. And this is an example that someone had put in their test. So this is their first question, and they have to actually agree or disagree with the statement. And it's just a reminder. And if we do this, the advice that we've been giving people to use for every single quiz or every single assignment, every single thing that you have them is a constant reminder that I am following the academic misconduct rules, right? And I have set the expectations, and in no way can you do X, Y, and Z, right? So you're putting those expectations there, and they are having to agree to it. That's why there are whole universities set up on honor codes. Right? All right. I mentioned something about the ExamSoft proctoring, and I know that we're at 12. I'll just take 2 seconds here to say that we do have Proctorio. It is, I answered a couple questions on this in the chat. We really do want for you to think about how to exhaust all other options first. You can use Proctorio. You do not, it's not quite as limited as it was for spring and summer. But if you're going to use it, you need to provide students with an understanding of what those technical requirements are, because, for example, they cannot use it on iPads. They cannot use it on their phones. So they need to know upfront that this particular course is going to be using Proctorio, and you will need to have a laptop or a desktop in order to do this. If they do not have access to those things, you need to find out who does not have access. And the way that the university has set this up as of this morning is that then you'll need to consult with your department to figure out what are ways that I need to accommodate these students, because you will need to find a way to accommodate those students who cannot use Proctorio, because there's also an additional expense. All right, for some students, it's a lot. So using Proctorio is not a simple answer. There's a lot of things to consider. So we always suggest consulting with your program or your college leadership to talk through, what are some of your options? What are the best ways to approach all of this? So I promised you some resources. The slides have been posted several times. They will also, the actual videos of this will also be up on our playlist, which is this last link here. I mentioned those consultations. We've got the Drake Institute. I did change the sentence. Now Drake Institute at osu.edu. I don't know why it still says UITL, but the Drake Institute, you can email them. You can go to our form for getting an OD consultation. The Carmen at osu.edu, please, we've mentioned this in the chat several times too. That one is like if you have a tool problem, like I can't figure out how to punch, like what's the button I push, right? That's the Carmen team. We also put the Student Life Disability Services link on here as a reminder that they are there they're still working, they're there to help you when you have a student who needs an accommodation and you're not quite sure how to make that happen. I have not heard that they'll have a limited number of students that they can actually serve. I haven't heard that. I don't know if Sarah's heard that, but I have not heard that. Okay. So we have some time to answer the rest of those questions. For those of you who need to leave us, I appreciate you hanging on for the last few minutes here. I do just want to end by saying that, we just want you to be realistic about what you can modify with the time constraints that we have. Consider which modifications would be small but have high impact that you can work on first. And really think through those authentic assignments. And again, if you need help kind of thinking through what would those look like, please contact, particularly the Drake Institute would be a great resource for that. And then I just want to thank you for joining us. And remember to go to that Keep Teaching site. We continue to add material there. So let's just take a little bit of time to make sure that we've answered everyone's questions. If you have to go or don't have any more questions, thank you so much for joining us. It was a joy for particularly Sarah, Teresa, and I to get back together again, our old team, and work together. So we appreciate you joining us, and we always appreciate Queenie doing her magnificent chat monitoring work as she always does. So have a great rest of your day, and please do not hesitate to contact us if you have questions or need some resources.